Today we will look at some interesting and unusual facts about the Great Depression in the United States. The Great Depression is usually associated with total unemployment and economic collapse. However, this common image does not fully reflect the complexity of the situation. In fact, there was growth and prosperity in some unexpected industries and even entire regions of the United States during this period. Let's move on to the first factor, which was the country's prosperity itself, even during the Great Depression. Although industrial production and agriculture were experiencing a major decline, some sectors of the economy were able not only to survive, but also to show growth. One such example is the entertainment industry. While millions of Americans suffered from poverty, the film industry was experiencing its so-called golden age. Hollywood was releasing more and more movies, and the cinemas were overcrowded. This phenomenon was explained by the fact that for many people, going to the cinema was an easy way to escape. They could forget about the difficult life for a few hours. Tickets were cheap, and the movies showed them bright stories and fantasies that were so lacking in the grey reality. People were looking for solace and a way to escape, and the film industry gave them this in full measure. In addition, the alcohol industry also received a big boost, as the legalization of alcohol production and sales created new jobs and a huge market that grew rapidly despite the general economic stagnation. The state could also receive significant tax revenues, which was extremely important in the context of budget cuts. This legalization was not only for money, but also for other social reasons. But it gave a huge boost to a whole new part of the economy. They offered affordable goods at a time when people were really saving. People couldn't buy expensive things, but they still needed simple household goods, clothing, and hygiene products. These stores became a salvation for millions of Americans, because they could find everything they needed at low prices. It turns out that when people stopped buying expensive goods, the demand for cheap ones actually increased. Now let's look at a fact that was regional. Some cities and states that had unusual economic structures or government investment were able to experience relative stability and even growth. For example, Washington, which was the District of Columbia, was somewhat shielded from the worst of the Depression because it had a lot of stable government jobs and government money to help fight the crisis. Likewise, regions that were actively building large infrastructure projects, which were then financed by the government, experienced economic growth, creating jobs and inspiring local commerce, despite the overall national decline. These projects, while they might not have changed the overall picture, did create small pockets of prosperity in a sea of need. Let's now look at various examples of this, and one of the most striking images is the success of the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer film studio. It was she who released various famous films in the 30s, one of which was Gone with the Wind, as well as The Wizard of Oz and King Kong. These films collected huge amounts of money, and stars such as Shirley Temple, Greta Garbo, and Clark Gable became symbols of hope and distraction for millions in difficult times. Thus, the weekly attendance of movie theaters in the United States in those years often exceeded even 80 million people, which for a country with a population of about 130 million was a colossal figure. Even if a person did not have money for food, he often found at least $1 to go to the cinema, which speaks of the priority that people gave to entertainment as a form of psychological survival. Another important factor worth mentioning is radio broadcasting. Radio became the main source of news, entertainment, and information. People who could not afford newspapers or movies gathered around radios to listen to their favorite programs, Franklin Roosevelt's presidential fireside chats, or sports broadcasts. The production of radios and the demand for them remained relatively stable or even increased in some years. Creating jobs in the electronics industry, it was a more passive and economical entertainment than movies, and was available to virtually every household that had a radio. Companies that made everyday products, like soap like Procter & Gamble, or food like Kellogg's, which was a breakfast cereal maker, were able to not only survive but also sell more. They offered cheaper options and heavily marketed them to people who wanted to save money. When people had less money, they bought cheaper brands or products that lasted longer. This forced manufacturers to adapt. For example, they began making new, more economical packages so that people could buy less without spending a lot at once. This massive project, which began in 1931 and was completed in 1936, attracted thousands of workers from all over the country who were desperately looking for work. Satellite towns like Boulder City, Nevada, were built specifically to house the workers and their families, creating a local economy that was based on construction, supplies, and services. The wages paid to the workers supported local stores, restaurants, and housing, creating an island of relative prosperity in the midst of the Depression. All of these examples of prosperity in individual sectors and regions did not, of course, negate the scale and depth of the Great Depression. Rather, they emphasized its complex and multifaceted nature. First, they demonstrated that the crisis was not completely uniform across the country. Its impact varied and depended on regional specialization, employment structure, and the availability of public investment. Second, these growth areas show us how people and industries adapted to new realities, and the entertainment industry satisfied the psychological needs of the population, and the producers of cheap goods, their basic economic needs. State infrastructure projects, although they could not completely solve the problem of unemployment at the national level, they still provided local employment and stimulated the economy in specific regions. These facts serve as a reminder to us all that even in the most difficult conditions, there were still mechanisms for survival and adaptation to different conditions. But you may be wondering why some industries and regions thrived during the Great Depression, but I can tell you that it was important for several reasons. First, it helped show us how important it is to diversify the economy. Secondly, it proves that human psychology does play a big role in the economy. The entertainment industry helped people escape their problems. It was a safe place for the psyche, and it helped them cope with stress and hopelessness. It was like a general escape from reality, but it supported the entire industry. And of course, it showed that even in the face of a lack of funds, consumers still had basic needs that needed to be met. Manufacturers that focused on the mass and low-cost segment of the market were able to not only survive, but also thrive, demonstrating the sustainability of the sales model based on availability. And finally, those examples of government infrastructure projects showed that targeted investments could create local economic advances that were capable of mitigating the effects of the crisis and giving people hope. This experience later influenced the way countries began to manage their money and budgets. It also greatly influenced Keynes's theory, which said that the state should actively help the economy by creating demand and jobs during crises. If we clearly recognize and understand these points, we can see the Great Depression more realistically. After all, it was a time when not everything was bad, and there were moments of improvement even in the darkest years. But this does not mean that people did not suffer. On the contrary, the suffering was enormous. It just helps to better understand how the crisis developed and how people adapted to it. The second rather unusual factor was that even during the Great Depression, the suicide rate was much lower than one might expect. Of course, given the catastrophic unemployment, mass poverty, homelessness, and general sense of hopelessness, one would expect a sharp and persistent spike in suicides during the Great Depression. Logic would tell us that the worse the economic situation, the higher the level of despair, and, as a result, people simply choose to end their lives. However, the statistics of the time showed a surprisingly complex picture. Although there was an increase in the early years of the crisis, later, during the height of the Depression, this increase slowed down, and at some points the suicide rate even declined. We know that at the beginning of the Great Depression, from 1929 to 1932, the suicide rate actually increased. In 1929, for every 100,000 people, there were 13.9 suicides, and by 1932, this number had risen to 17.4. This increase was expected because the sudden stock market crash, loss of money, business failures, and mass unemployment left many Americans in shock and despair. People who had grown accustomed to the good life were completely unprepared for such rapid and dramatic changes. However, contrary to what many expected, in the following years, as the Great Depression was in full swing and economic hardships became even worse and longer lasting, the suicide rate became stable and even began to decline. By 1933, there were 15.3 suicides for every 100,000 people, and by 1937, there were 14.3 suicides. All this was slightly more than before the crisis in 1929. This seems very strange, especially when compared to how people behave during crises in other countries or according to today's data, which often shows a direct link between a bad economy and mental health problems. But there are several factors that could explain this phenomenon. First, there is the effect of unification or crisis solidarity. In conditions of common disaster, people often feel more connected to each other, less ashamed of their situation because everyone around them is suffering. Understanding that a person was not alone in such a situation could reduce feelings of guilt, shame, and isolation, which were strong factors in suicide. Secondly, people had already become accustomed to the new conditions. After the initial shock of the crisis, they gradually adapted to a more difficult life. Expectations became lower, and survival became the main goal. When unemployment affected many, job loss ceased to be a shame, but simply became a reality. This adaptation, although painful, could reduce the strong psychological pressure of the crisis. And third, government programs called Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and launched in 1933 played a major role. While these programs didn't solve all the problems, they gave people a sense that the government was doing something to help. They provided some social safety net, and just as important, they gave them hope for the future. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration gave millions of people not just money, but a sense of purpose and dignity. We should also not forget about the changing social and cultural context. At that time, attitudes towards mental illness and suicide were very different than today, and the level of stigma was very high. Of course, this could have affected how causes of death were documented, and the data could be incomplete. It is difficult to find exact personal stories that explain why suicides decreased. But let's look at this from other facts. One important point was the role of churches and local communities. During the Depression, many churches and charitable groups became centers of help. They were the ones who provided not only food, but also psychological support. Various soup kitchens, shelters, clothing distribution. All this created a feeling of unity and support. People who were in despair could come there for help and advice, and this reduced their feeling of loneliness. Another important point is the effect when people find themselves in the same situation. When your neighbor, friend, or relative also lost their job, unemployment ceased to be something shameful. People understood that the problem was not their personal failure or mistake, but a crisis that affected everyone. This helped them feel part of a common group of victims and not blame only themselves. For example, in books and stories, you can often read how people shared their last piece of bread or helped each other find work. And this, in turn, showed how strong mutual assistance was. The so-called New Deal programs played a key role in restoring hope. When young people who might otherwise have been without jobs or a future joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, they got more than just money. They learned discipline, did manual labor, learned new skills, and felt part of something important. Thousands of young people built roads, planted trees, and improved parks. It gave them purpose and helped distract them from their despair. The opportunity to earn a living, even if the pay was small, helped restore people's self-esteem. It is also worth remembering that examples from everyday life could also show that people began to stick closer to each other. For example, radio became very popular. It not only entertained, but also brought families and neighbors together, because everyone listened to the same news and programs. People felt that they were being spoken to directly, that their problems were understood, and that solutions were being actively sought. This was a strong psychological support that gave people faith that the government would be able to cope with the crisis. And later studies showed that during major disasters for the whole country, wars or natural disasters, the number of suicides often temporarily decreases. This is explained by the fact that personal problems become less important when there is a common threat. The Great Depression, although an economic crisis, had much in common with such national disasters, which could have caused a similar effect. This fact that suicide rates dropped during the height of the Depression is important to understand for a full understanding of the crisis itself. It shows that people responded to very difficult times in ways that were far more complex than just economic indicators. While economic hardships certainly caused much suffering, social support, adaptation, and government action could lessen the worst psychological blows. It also shows that hope and a sense of community can be very powerful antidote to despair, even in the darkest of times. But it is also important to understand that government assistance, however small it may seem, sometimes played an important role in maintaining the spirit of the nation. Moreover, this was different from modern crises, when economic downturns were often accompanied by a steady increase in mental health problems. This may also indicate changes in the way society is structured and how it supports people. I think we can move on to the analysis and conclusions. Analysis of how the number of suicides changed during the Great Depression. Well, firstly, it is worth mentioning that it shows how strong the human psyche is and how well people can adapt even to the most difficult conditions. After the initial shock of the crisis, people were able to find ways to cope with it. Secondly, it speaks of the important role of connections between people and support within society. Mutual assistance, solidarity, and a sense of importance became a strong defense against despair and thoughts of suicide. And third, we must not underestimate the influence of leaders and government programs. Roosevelt's New Deal not only helped the economy, but also served a very important psychological function. It gave people hope that their situation would improve and convinced them that the government would not abandon them in trouble. This sense of care and active action on the part of the authorities became a powerful antidote to hopelessness. This unusual fact makes us wonder how society's reactions to crises differ at different times. The lesson of the Great Depression is that even when things are very hard, coming together, hoping, and taking action can help avoid the worst mental health consequences for a country. That's not to say people didn't suffer. They did, but it does show the hidden forces of resilience and cooperation that were at work in those years. Well, we are gradually moving on to the third factor, which was the popularity of ideas of a simple life. At first glance, the Great Depression is associated with poverty and impoverishment, but it also caused an unexpected cultural shift. It was that people began to value the simple life again and actively used the exchange of goods without money. When money was scarce and the usual methods of economy stopped working, many Americans were forced to return to simpler but more effective ways of exchange and self-sufficiency. This not only helped them to survive the economic crisis, but also showed that people had greatly revised their values. Material things lost their importance, and survival depended on mutual aid and ingenuity. It was a forced step, but it was precisely this that helped people to adapt and move away from the consumer ideals of previous years. When millions of people lost their jobs, homes, and all their savings, and banks closed one after another, money lost a lot of value. Because of this, people started looking for other ways to get what they needed. One of these ways was the so-called barter, when people exchanged goods or services directly, without money. For example, farmers could exchange part of their harvest for a carpenter's work or a visit to the doctor, and ordinary city dwellers exchanged clothes or household items for food. This return to barter was not just an old way, but a very good solution when money was short. Along with barter, the concept of simple living became popular again. People did not choose it consciously, but were forced to live this way by circumstances. They learned to do without unnecessary things, to repair old things instead of buying new ones. Many began to grow food on their own plots and to prepare products. Ideas of self-sufficiency, which were previously characteristic only of certain groups or farmers, now became common practice for many. This change affected the kitchen. Simple, cheap ones became popular, which allowed to use all available products to the maximum. And home needlework, sewing and clothing repair also became popular because buying new clothes was too expensive. This change also manifested itself in the fact that people began to unite more in groups. They grew crops together, created communities to exchange goods and services. In some cities, even time banks or labor banks appeared, where people exchanged their skills. Let's look in more detail at the example of a carpenter who could earn hours by repairing his neighbor's roof, and then spend these hours to get help from a doctor who also participated in this system. This was a local economy that did not depend on the center, but worked alongside the collapsing monetary system. But all of this was also influenced by culture. Songs, movies, and books appeared that showed resilience, hard work, and helping each other. Although the media still showed that it was important to spend a lot, reality still forced people to reconsider their core values. Survival became an art, and resourcefulness and the ability to get by with little were very important qualities. This period became an important lesson for many Americans, and it was this period that showed that happiness and survival did not always depend on saving money. Now let's take a closer look at a few examples. One of the most striking examples of such exchanges was the emergence of exchange clubs, or unemployed cooperatives. In the 30s, thousands of such organizations appeared across the country. For example, in the city of Seattle, Washington, a cooperative called the Seattle Unemployed Exchange had up to 10,000 members at its most active period. People brought there whatever they had: potatoes, firewood, tools, their skills, and in return received credits. They could spend these credits on other things or services that cooperative members offered. The most famous example was when unemployed fishermen exchanged the fish they caught for a visit to the dentist or hairdresser. These cooperatives often had their own internal money that did not depend on the dollar. People then used any available land, abandoned vacant lots, their own backyards, even public parks, to grow vegetables. Ultimately, this not only gave them food, but also occupation, a sense of purpose, and some independence from the monetary system. It was also believed that in the 30s, tens of millions of Americans gardened in their homes in one way or another. For example, the mayor of Detroit, Michigan, even helped establish such gardens by donating soil and seeds to help needy families. There was also a method called train hopping, which was when unemployed men, sometimes even entire families, moved around the country in search of work, also using barter. They exchanged their odd services, such as helping out on the farm or around the house, for food or a place to sleep. It was common in many homes to leave food for these wanderers or offer them a small job in exchange for food. It is also worth remembering that the literature of the time also showed this trend. Books such as The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck tell how families migrating from a region suffering from drought survived through mutual aid and barter. Although they sought work for money, their daily lives often included non-monetary exchange and self-sufficiency. There were even cookbooks with recipes for frugal cooking, where the main focus was on cheap products and minimal waste. Such exchanges and simple living became very popular during the Great Depression. This clearly shows us how well people can adapt to very difficult economic situations. It was a necessary but vital departure from the buying everything that had been very fashionable in the previous 10 years. Such approaches not only helped people survive when money was short, but also strengthened social ties and mutual aid. They also showed us that the economy does not always have to depend only on money, and that human ingenuity can come up with a way out of any situation, even when the usual systems did not work. This period became a kind of social experiment, which showed how resilient society is and how capable it is of self-organization in conditions of chaos. It also demonstrated how deeply the crisis affected not only the economy, but also ordinary life, and of course people's values. So it's worth saying that the phenomenon of exchange and simple living during the Great Depression taught us, of course, several important lessons. First, it shows that an economy can work even without conventional money, when people simply exchange what they need. It's an example of how a society can return to the simplest ways of communicating if more complex systems collapse. Secondly, it speaks to how strong people are in their ability to adapt and invent new things. When faced with shortages, people did not give up, but actively sought and found new ways to survive, often using old proven methods. And thirdly, this period showed how important connections between people and support in society are. Associations, exchange clubs, and simply help from neighbors became a very important defense against despair and hunger. They proved that in times of crisis, human relationships and the ability to act together can be no less, and sometimes even more valuable, than personal savings. Thus, the shift to the simple life had long-lasting cultural consequences. For an entire generation of Americans, the Depression experience forever cemented the habits of thrift, saving, and the value of making things with your own hands. Many who lived through the Depression carried these habits throughout their lives, even when the economy improved again. It was a bitter but important lesson about what really matters when survival becomes the primary goal. Now we move on to the penultimate fact that will tell us about organized crime and its unusual roles. Since the Great Depression brought with it terrible economic instability, it became the perfect breeding ground for crime. Gangsters like Al Capone became almost legendary, and illegal alcohol trade and gambling flourished. But what is also surprising is that, in addition to their crimes, the mafia and gangs suddenly began to perform some social tasks. In conditions when government agencies could not cope, they maintained at least some order and even offered help to those who could not get it anywhere else. This, in an unusual way, linked crime with how society survived in those years. Let's also look at the Prohibition period, which lasted from 1920 to 1933, and it had already helped crime grow by making the alcohol trade a very profitable, albeit illegal, business. When the Depression began, millions of people were left without work, and the government was struggling to cope with the crisis. At this time, criminal groups received new opportunities, and one of those opportunities, of course, was the illegal trade in alcohol. Even after Prohibition was repealed in 1933, the criminal gangs that sold alcohol did not go away. They simply switched to other illegal activities, which included gambling, lending money at huge interest rates, prostitution, and extortion. These services were needed by people because many were looking for some kind of entertainment from poverty, or were forced to borrow money from loan sharks because banks would not give loans. Also, at the time when the state aid system was very weak and could not cope, criminal gangs sometimes performed tasks similar to social. For example, they could provide work for various gangs, offered work to thousands of unemployed people. These were couriers, fighters, those who distributed alcohol, croupiers, or security guards. For a person who was dying of hunger, such work, although dangerous, but it was the only way to earn money. I would also like to mention that in some areas, especially where the police were corrupt or poorly run, the mafia could resolve disputes, often in very brutal ways. For ordinary people, this sometimes seemed a quicker and more straightforward way to get justice than going through the slow and overburdened officialdom. And of course, there was ostentatious charity back then. Some gangsters, especially in big cities, staged public charity events. They opened soup kitchens, gave food to the poor, sponsored local festivals. This helped them create the image of people's heroes, which gave them support among the population and interfered with the work of the police. Of course, this was wrong, but for hungry people, any help was valuable. To illustrate this, I will give you a few examples, one of which was Al Capone in Chicago. His huge business, built on selling illegal alcohol, lending money at high interest rates, gambling, and prostitution, brought him a lot of money. During the Depression, when many people in Chicago were starving, Capone opened one of the first soup kitchens in the city. On Thanksgiving Day, 1930, he gave out thousands of meals to the homeless and unemployed. This created an image of him as a man who cared for the common people, in contrast to the government, which did nothing. And despite his cruelty and crimes, many saw him as someone who could provide them with at least a minimum of survival. This phenomenon eventually spread to lesser-known but numerous local gangs. They controlled their neighborhoods, collected tribute from merchants, but could also protect them from other gangs or even corrupt officials. Sometimes they even acted as protectors for ethnic communities that felt abandoned by official authorities. I want to say that the crime rise during the Depression is a dark but important part of that time. It shows that when the state fails and there is no help, shadowy groups can take over. That criminals took on almost social roles ultimately spoke to the deep desperation of people and how poorly the state's social safety net worked. It did not excuse the gangsters' actions, but it did explain why many people, having no other choice, were willing to cooperate with them or even support them. It also shows how societies can adapt to survive, even when that adaptation is not moral or legal. So all this could also give us some important lessons to avoid repeating anything like this in the future. Firstly, it shows that economic crises do not just make people poor. They also destabilize society, opening the door to illegal activity. Secondly, it emphasized the importance of strong and well-functioning government bodies. They are the ones who must ensure security, order, and help people. When these functions weaken, other forces can take their place. Third, it showed how difficult the moral choices were for people in desperate times. It made them question whether they were willing to accept help from criminals when legal options were closed. Ultimately, this phenomenon also influenced the development of the police and law enforcement system in the United States. After the Depression, it was given more resources and powers to fight organized crime. In the end, the social roles of the mafia were a forced and dangerous response to a deep crisis. But they became an integral part of the landscape of the Great Depression. It is a story about how even the most unpleasant elements of society can find their place in chaos, using people's desperation for their own benefit. And now we come to the last factor, which was the slowdown in birth rates and major changes. The Great Depression affected not only the economy and people's behavior, but also how many children were born in the United States, causing a sudden and noticeable decline in the birth rate. This was not due to poverty alone, but rather to a whole host of social and psychological factors that forced Americans to take a new look at having children. This fact shows how a serious economic crisis can change the very foundations of society, affecting future generations and what the country's population will look like many years from now. The birth rate had already been declining, but the Depression made it much worse. And you may be wondering why this happened at all. But I can tell you that there were several reasons for this, and we'll look at the main ones. The first was economic uncertainty. In fact, it was the main reason for everything. Because of mass unemployment, loss of money, and uncertainty about the future, couples postponed weddings and having children. They simply could not afford a large family. Having a child in such conditions would mean additional expenses and would condemn him to poverty. The next factor was the decline in marriages, which dropped very sharply in the early years of the Depression as people waited for the economy to improve before taking on the responsibility of starting a family. Fewer marriages meant fewer births. The idea of family has also changed over time, with survival becoming a priority and the idea of the American dream being undermined, and many young people becoming more conscious of family size in an effort to avoid the fate of their parents who might not be able to feed their children. Don't forget about the availability of contraception. Although information about contraception and its availability were less than now, in the 30s there were already ways to control births. The crisis may have forced people to use them more often, or at least to look for information about them. The Depression taught people to be more careful and prudent in this matter. And of course, don't forget about the psychological factor, because the general atmosphere of despondency and despair could also influence the decision to have children. In such conditions, people may have felt that they did not want to bring a new generation into a world filled with suffering and limitations. To fully understand the topic, it is worth looking at various examples, and one of the most striking manifestations of this change in the population is the emergence of the lost generation, or Depression generation. It was much smaller in size than the groups of people born before or after it, for example, the so-called baby boomers. This generation, born in the 30s, grew up in conditions of austerity and need, and this shaped their values. Now let's talk about statistics. For example, in the 20s, when the country was flourishing, about 25 children were born per 1,000 people. And by 1933, at the height of the Depression, this number had fallen to a record low at that time, 18.4. This was the lowest value in the history of the United States at that time. It can also be said that various family histories of the time often confirm this trend. Many couples who lived through the Depression told how they put off marriage for years, waiting until they could find stable work. Those who were already married deliberately had fewer children, believing that they could not afford more. For example, in rural areas, where more children were usually born, there was also a noticeable decline, as farmers struggled with low crop prices and droughts, and the birth rate decline had profound consequences. It changed the age structure of the population, put pressure on the school system in the following years, and on the labor market when this generation entered working age. The state and scientists began to study these changes carefully. They understood that this was very important for planning for the distant future. This birth rate decline was one of the reasons why the government began to think about creating more developed social assistance and insurance systems for people in the future. It shows that uncertainty about the future can completely change how many children are born and affect the size and composition of society for decades to come. This fact also shows that decisions about having children are not always made spontaneously. They are closely related to how confident people feel about the economy and the future. It was not just poverty, but fear of poverty, that determined whether people would have children or not. Thus, the Depression changed not only the economy, but also the very essence of American society. Second, it highlights that decisions about having children are not just a personal matter, but a social phenomenon that reflects shared expectations and fears. Uncertainty about the future can lead to lower birth rates, even when there are no obvious financial problems. Third, the effects of this change in fertility were felt for many decades. The generation born in the 30s was smaller in number, and this affected the labor market, consumer demand, and even government policies, such as the pension system. This fact clearly reminds us that major economic crises leave a deep mark not only on the economy, but also on the appearance of a country's population. It also forces us to think about how today's economic problems may affect fertility and future population changes. Ultimately, all these facts about the Great Depression were able to show us that human society is much more complex than it seems. Crises do not always lead to the expected consequences, and people are capable of showing resilience, ingenuity, and mutual assistance. The lessons of the Depression are relevant in our time. They remind us of social support, adaptation, and that hope can be a powerful force even in the most difficult times.